This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. On the local news roundup, the coronavirus arrives in North Carolina. Officials say they are prepared, so stay calm. Super Tuesday brings the number of Democratic candidates down to 2, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and identifies those running for other key races here. 2 big development projects are in the news, one uptown, the other in Ballantyne. Cat says it won't make its climate goals, and another black eye for Wells Fargo. Our roundtable of reporters is ready to detail those and other stories, and seated around this table are David Borax, reporter for WFAE News. Good morning.
Hello, Mike.
Glenn Berkins is here. He's editor and publisher of QCityMetro.com. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Katie Peralta is back, senior editor at Charlotte Agenda. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And Eric Spanberg is managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal. Hello.
Hello, Mike.
We're on the radio. We're on Facebook Live. What more could you want? The coronavirus pandemic has now arrived in North Carolina this week. A person tested positive in the Wake County area for COVID-19. That's the name of the virus officially, which he traveled to Washington State. He or she traveled to Washington State and was visiting a long-term care facility there when the case of the disease was reported. And this North Carolinian and their family are in quarantine at home. State officials say we should stay calm. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. Governor Roy Cooper has said that more cases are expected, but not to worry.
I know people are worried about this virus, and I want to assure you that the state of North Carolina is prepared.
You say we're the problem, David.
You know, it's the lead story every hour on the TV news, and it just seems like we are part of the problem here. We are promoting the idea that this is something that people need to stop and be worried about. I mean, let's put it into perspective, you know.
Okay.
There have been, 233 deaths globally, 12 in the U.S. so far. Compare that to the typical seasonal influenza. There's been at least 18,000 deaths in the U.S. this flu season. So I'm not trying to belittle the idea that there's not, or say that there's nothing here. I mean, there's definitely a new virus that we need to take seriously, but maybe it could be the third or fourth story in the hour or be on page 5 or something.
I think that's 3,000 deaths globally. I think you said 300, but I think it's 3,000.
Yes.
Right.
It's 3,000.
Well, this is the problem. The number changes
Right.
every hour, every day, and that's why people are so alarmed by it.
But it
And
is
while
the
this is a
go ahead.
serious disease, its fatality rate is not all that high. In the 90s,
But Glenn, it's if it's 0.1% for the flu versus 3.4%, that's considerably different.
And this morning on NPR, they put out a new report. Doctors in Hong Kong are saying it's probably more like 1.4%.
Okay.
Which
Anyway.
is,
And I'm not necessarily comparing it to the flu. I'm just saying that there are other diseases out there, Ebola for one, which you all might remember several years ago. There was a big scare in the U.S. over that, where the death rate from that is in the 90% range.
Yeah,
So
good point.
this person, we don't know whether this person is male or female, the one case that we have in North Carolina who was in Washington State before they came back to North Carolina. They're trying to find people that this patient came into contact with. He flew back to Raleigh-Durham Airport. I think it would be easy, obviously, to track the people who were on that airplane because they have a passenger list. But he was tested 10 days after he came home, and that airplane, I'm sure, was turned around in 2.5 hours and sent someplace else. How long does the virus last on surfaces? Does anybody know? I don't think anybody knows. So how can you really ward off this problem?
it may last for hours as opposed to days or
Yes.
anything. But, I mean, we do need to be careful of this stuff. And, there are probably a lot of cases that are going unreported right now, which is why there's some debate over what
and
the mortality
unknown
rate.
because we don't have enough test kits in the country.
The other thing is the symptoms don't present as anything out of the ordinary. I mean, you might look like you have a cold or something.
Right.
And sure, that might go on for several days. Perhaps you give it to somebody else who has a compromised immune system, like an elderly person. And for those folks who are a little bit more compromised, I would say it is a pretty big deal because they have to be extra cognizant. We all should be washing our hands for 20 seconds.
So it's like we're walking a tight wire here because it may not be big, but it may be big.
Right, we just don't know, and we fill in the blanks a lot of times
Right.
with errant information.
So yesterday, both Wells Fargo and Lowe's announced immediate travel restrictions for workers. Wells is restricting all non-essential air travel in this country. The bank's requiring executive approval for any essential business air travel. United Airlines has begun removing airplanes from their fleet and parking them because of the passenger levels dropping precipitously. What, if anything, has American Airlines, since we're a hub, what have they said about this?
Well, I think all the airlines are, while they're taking different actions, they're essentially saying the same things of monitoring and talking to health officials. I can tell you one thing that stands out about American Airlines is that their stock fell 13% yesterday. So that's a sign that they're all dealing with, I think, as big of a problem as the uncertainty is the fact that people are canceling flights. They're canceling events. They're canceling conferences and conventions. I think Joe Bruno, our compadre, had a tweet yesterday about a convention that's been canceled in Charlotte that was supposed to be here later this month. So that's the real concern.
There were a series of photographs in the New York Times, I believe it was, of some of the biggest tourist destinations around the world,
right,
in front of the Louvre, in some places in Paris and so forth. And the streets were absolutely empty.
Yeah.
People are frightened by this.
Well, there's this. I think it was the New York Times. I get so many different things on my phone, but they were moving. They were small, short movie clips from space. You can see this from space. They were looking down, like at the Trevi Fountain, and some places in London and other places in Italy, and they had a normal picture, and a picture yesterday, and there was nobody there.
Another one of those comparisons that we saw were the photograph or the graphics that show pollution in China. And right now, pollution in China, on a typical day, the whole map is orange and red, and right now it's white.
Not to make fun of a family member, but we were joking ahead of the show that one of my sisters called and asked me if I wanted her to overnight me some N95 masks.
What is that?
Those are the masks supposedly that
Actually work. The ones that actually work.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I guess the big question on everybody's mind is, because we're not really testing effectively in this country, because we don't have the kits in the supply enough to do so, how prepared are we? How prepared is Raleigh? They have the only case in North Carolina, but it seems that everybody who gets this spreads it to at least 2 other people. So that's exponential. So how prepared is Raleigh? How prepared are hospitals here for this if we should have a problem?
So most of the hospitals around the state have had press conferences and announced that they're doing everything they can to get ready. I mean, if we think about this as the end of the world, then they're not ready. But if we think about this as something that eventually will become a routine occurrence, then I think they're probably ready.
Mecklenburg County's Health Director, Gibby Harris, had this advice.
If you're going to a location where we know there are cases, such as a Seattle, I would suggest thinking twice.
There you go. The yin and yang continues. One of the problems on the national level is getting these testing kits for health professionals to use, and experts say that without these kits, we cannot be sure how many people are, in fact, right now infected. The Observer reported yesterday that the Charlotte hospitals can test for the virus, and atrium patients could meet with doctors online to avoid spreading germs through the hospital system's virtual visits and e-visits programs. Novant also offering e-visits and video visits. I thought they were the same thing, but maybe not. Officials say, here are the mortality rates. Mortality rate is about 1.4%. That means 98.6% of people will get through this illness unscathed.
And many of those who die from the disease or from the illness have underlying health problems. They're not healthy people, they're older people.
All right. So has anybody said what the symptoms are? How can you tell if you have a cold, if you have the flu, or you have this?
Well, I think that goes back to what Katie was saying. I mean, fever, cough, a lot of these things just feel like a cold or the flu.
There was a press conference, I believe Iranian officials held, and you can tell one of the gentlemen, I don't know what his title was, but he's actively sweating and wiping his brow. And it turns out he had been diagnosed with the coronavirus after that. So I guess sweating, cough, I don't know if fever is
one. There's a lot of jokes around in the office and elsewhere, somebody sneezes or coughs and everybody kind of like covers their mouth.
Right.
But, there's a lot of panic and politics around this, and people are taking advantage of the situation. I mean, I think some of the stories that we're seeing about this are people trying to to make money or get some political advantage. I do want to point out one thing that I just read in the Washington Post, which is that Jim Baker, the former half of the Jim Baker and Tammy Faye Baker duo here in Charlotte that got in trouble for their ministry, he's now selling a miracle cure, and he's been hit with a cease and desist order by the New York Attorney General for false advertising. And he claims that this silver solution miracle cure will wipe out the virus.
Does that mean my order's not going to come? Are they going to?
I'm sorry to say, Eric, that your order is dead.
So a lot of businesses are sending out emails to their customers, emails to their employees. I know that the building, I think, that our radio station is housed in has sent an email out. We sent an email out to staff about all of this. A lot of employees in other businesses have been urged to stay home if they feel sick. But not everybody can do that. I mean, some hourly workers, if they stay home, they don't get paid. That's part of a problem here, isn't it? Not just with this, but with maybe this will help us to rethink our attitudes toward health care. Because if you don't have health care, you're liable not to go get tested.
So I'm going to...
And you can't take time off because you're an hourly employee?
I want to throw a little bit of a personal story out. My wife is in Asia this year on a Fulbright fellowship.
Right now?
Right now. And she had been scheduled to spend the spring semester in
right,
Shanghai.
we're all backing away.
That's it. She's scheduled.
Can we do this by teleconference?
She was scheduled to spend the spring semester in Shanghai, and mainly because everything was shut down and nobody was around and she wouldn't be able to do interviews. She actually went back to Taipei, where she spent the fall semester, and she's there now, back in her same apartment in her same office. But she did a blog post the other day about what the situation is there. And yes, people in Asia already wear masks when they're worried about getting sick. That hasn't really changed. But one of the things that she mentioned along what you were saying there, Mike, is that in Taiwan they have a universal healthcare system. And so if you are feeling sick, you go to the doctor. People do it.
How about
it doesn't cost them money. It's something that there's no barriers to that.
Yeah.
And so in our situation here, people stay away from the doctor because they don't want to pay.
So the yin and yang, it is the media perhaps, because we do, every network, everything is leading with this story. But then you have things like the World Health Organization, who are urging governments around the world to act now against this virus. Quote, "This is not a drill. This is not the time to give up. This is not a time for excuses. This is a time for pulling out all the stops. Countries have been planning for scenarios like this for decades. Now is the time to act on those plans." End quote. That's from the WHO Director General. It sounds dire. Meanwhile, you have President Trump saying we might get the sniffles, and we have state officials saying stay calm, while businesses on Wall Street, while the stock market is cratering. I mean,
It is. It's dizzying.
Don't look at your 401k this week.
Don't look at that. I mean, it is. It's one of those things. It's all the unknown and uncertainty. I think people's heads are just spinning. They don't know what to do.
And I think only in hindsight will we be able to look back on this and say whether it was justified or an overreaction.
People keep pointing to the swine flu outbreak, which I barely remember. I mean, I remember being on the radio and talking about it, but I barely remember it, and it was much worse than this. Did we all react like this for the swine flu? I can't remember.
I can't remember either. I know
I don't
that
remember that we reacted so heavily like we have.
It was probably less media.
Well,
probably certainly less social media.
I think that the other thing nationally, I mean, it's obviously calling to question leadership. And I think no matter what the situation, you probably want a leader who is saying, we have this under control, be prepared, instead of undermining his health professionals.
Well, speaking of leadership, there was a vote to change the guard all over the Southeast this past week, Super Tuesday. We'll talk about that and the results here as well. Donald Trump, speaking of leaders, was here on Monday, and we'll talk about that and more when we come back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new 2023-row Subaru Ascent with room for 8 passengers. Details at tyndallsubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. And Taylor, Richards, and Conger hosting trunk shows for women, featuring Peter Cohen, March 12th through 14th, and Pezrico, March 27th through 28th in Phillips Place. Details at trcstyle.com. The topic of affordable housing has made it into the Democratic presidential race. You can't tell from the debates, but both remaining candidates have plans. Joe Biden's proposal would spend more than $500 billion on housing initiatives. Bernie Sanders would pump more than $1 trillion into the National Housing Trust Fund. So how would these plans address the problem? We're going to talk about that on the next edition of Politics Monday. Monday at 9, right here on WFAE.
A Super Tuesday surge makes Joe Biden think he'll be the one to take on Donald Trump.
I will beat him, period. He's even risked his presidency because he doesn't want to face me.
California declares a state of emergency, and a tornado kills dozens in Tennessee. I'm Todd Zwillick. It's the Friday News Roundup. That's next time on 1A.
The roundup of the week's news continues with 1A after Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded, 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. It's the local news roundup. I'm Mike Collins here with Eric Spanberg from the Business Journal, Katie Peralta from Charlotte Agenda, Glenn Berkins from QCityMetro.com, and David Borax from WFAE News. North Carolina was among 14 giant killers this week. As the result of Super Tuesday, we saw the Democratic field winnowed down to 2, Bernie Sanders and the sudden frontrunner, Joe Biden.
We are very much alive!
Elizabeth Warren dropped out on Wednesday. Mike Bloomberg the day before. Bloomberg threw his support to Biden, as did Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, who dropped out prior to Super Tuesday. Warren is still not endorsing anybody. Is that correct?
Correct. She has said she wants a little time to think about it.
Yeah.
She also is urging people to vote with their hearts, which apparently they didn't do enough to suit her.
Biden's performance in South Carolina was a big surprise last week to many people and a relief to him, and it led to his Super Tuesday victory. What role did our voters, North Carolina voters, play in continuing to push him forward? Because he did really well in North Carolina.
Yeah, he won by, 19 points here. He won by 28 in South Carolina. Look, he just swept the South. I mean, people said it over and over again. The thing that struck me is so funny is, I think back to 4 years ago, everybody, political analysts got it all wrong. Here we are, 2020. Joe Biden has absolutely no chance. Bernie Sanders is in command, and now all of a sudden, forget about Bernie. It's just, it's interesting how quickly conventional wisdom falls by the wayside.
How quickly things changed over the last week. I mean, South Carolina really kind of changed the conversation a lot, and I think that really informed North Carolina voters, too. A lot of Democrats were thinking, look at what Joe Biden did in South Carolina. Maybe he is the safer bet. Maybe I should vote with him because I think that he has a better chance of winning.
And a lot of voters here and in Alabama and other southern states are African Americans, and they heard Jim Clyburn from South Carolina give his unabashed endorsement of Joe Biden. And Clyburn told MSNBC on election night that was his intent.
When I was asked what was my intent with the endorsement, I said I was trying to create a surge for Joe Biden. And so I feel that people got the message. And they got the message even though a lot of people voted early.
I want to push back on that just a little.
Okay.
I don't think African American voters are lemmings that just go out and vote for someone simply because someone recommended it. I think what you saw, a lot of us had Biden dead and buried, and I think what that victory in South Carolina did, and he was supposed to win in South Carolina, by the way, that margin was very impressive. But I think what that South Carolina victory did was it showed voters in other states, North Carolina, wherever else, that he wasn't dead. I don't think people changed their minds about him. I think these voters were people who probably wanted him to begin with, but were looking for an alternative candidate because they thought his campaign was dead. And when they realized that it wasn't dead in South Carolina, it gave them permission to go out and vote for him again.
I want to go back to the big picture here and remind people that the first couple of primaries and caucuses were not in states that were representative of the electorate. I mean, Biden was leading in the polls in South Carolina. We shouldn't have been surprised that he won. Maybe the margin of victory was a little more than people expected, but I think in North Carolina he was at the top of the polls as well.
Well, I think also, David, this is going to fuel the movement or the sentiment among some that why are we starting in Iowa and New Hampshire? These are not diverse states. They're not representative of the electorate at large, and certainly this plays into all of that.
I think
Guaranteed
that's
to
it.
give headlines to an underdog.
Yeah.
And look at what happened in Iowa. I mean, Pete Buttigieg won, and Biden floundered. So
Yes.
it calls into question, what are we doing?
Do we have the totals from Iowa yet? Is that?
We're never going to get
gosh.
those. We'll get them after Election Day. Charlotte Agenda reported, Katie, that Biden took I think I'm right about this. Biden took 188 out of Mecklenburg County's 195.
Yes, all but 7.
And they say his resurgence around the South on Super Tuesday was possible because of late deciders. They saw his victory, as we've been talking about, in South Carolina and decided he could do it after all. What does that say about early voters?
I mean, there's a lot of chatter on social media about, oh, what happens if I voted for Pete or Amy before Tuesday? And it's you don't get a redo. Yeah, your vote is for nothing, I
We
guess.
even had
I
a
mean,
press release about that. No, you can't vote again.
Right, which is, I mean, unfortunate. I'm sure that you would feel lousy if that were the case, but I don't want to encourage people to skip early voting because I think it is a really, it's a great option, especially if you don't have work off on, election day.
right.
But at the end of the day, essentially those votes are just lost.
Speaking of a redo, I wonder if the mayor and others in this city and elsewhere
Boy, there are a lot of them.
who got on the Bloomberg
Yeah.
train, if they will now,
It's a short ride, isn't it?
Let's see here.
if they will now endorse another
He
candidate.
had Mayor Lyles endorsed him. City Councilman James Mitchell ran his statewide campaign.
Yes.
Hugh McCall for his support to Bloomberg, as did former Governor Bev Perdue, Democratic leader Dan Blue, and the mayor of Raleigh.
And the mayor of
Columbia.
Columbia.
Yeah.
It was a serious question. I mean, I wasn't trying to make light of it. But now we have 2 viable candidates. So I wonder if they will.
Didn't the mayor? Am I mistaking the mayor of Columbia for the state newspaper? Didn't he throw his support to Buttigieg?
No, he was with Bloomberg.
Bloomberg. Okay.
Yes,
so
he was
the
with
state that
Bloomberg.
threw their support to.
Yeah.
Okay. So Mike Bloomberg, of course, bet it all on Super Tuesday and lost big. He was asked constantly, as voting was underway on Tuesday, about his viability as a candidate.
Do you feel any pressure today?
No intention of dropping out. We're in it to win it.
So he dropped out.
We're in it to win it until we're not.
Till we're not. He opened a 17,000 square foot campaign headquarters here, and you say, Katie, he needed to win Charlotte. The Charlotte Agenda this week said that Charlotte may be the siren of his campaign, or the siren city of his campaign. If he doesn't perform here, he's not likely to perform anywhere. How did he perform here?
He came in third behind Bernie Sanders.
So why were we the siren city? Why? Just 'cause
This is something that my colleague Michael Graff had written a
Yeah.
few weeks ago, and there's a political story out, I believe, on Monday, saying kind of a similar message. And this was something that Smudgy Mitchell had said. He needs to win here, and if he can't win here, then where can he win? We are a banking city. He had the endorsements of 2 of the most powerful people in the city. He pumped a ton of money into advertising in North Carolina, and it seemed like he was attracting people from kind of all different parts of town. People who consider themselves fairly moderate but want to beat Trump went in the Bloomberg direction. And so he saw this as kind of, I guess a barometer for how he could perform elsewhere. And Mecklenburg County flatly rejected that. And I guess, I'm really interested to see what happens to his campaign staff now. They were told that they have jobs through November. And now what? I know that they are kind of reassessing where things are, and things seem to change very quickly. Spent $500 million in advertising before this Tuesday, and now it's a big question.
I mean,
mark.
he's down to $61.8 billion, Katie. I don't know if he can
afford to.
How do you keep the lights on?
I don't know.
But you're right, though. I mean, how much motivation is left? Even though he has endorsed Biden, is he going to keep these people on staff and keep going?
So on Monday night, the eve of Super Tuesday, the president chose to come to Charlotte and the Bojangles Coliseum.
We like to troll. We like to go the night before one of their primaries. We do a little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
Of all the cities involved in Super Tuesday voting, why Charlotte? Why troll here?
Well, I think.
Why not?
Why not? You're in North Carolina. This is where you're going to have the convention. It makes sense. And he's been here quite often, as we know.
He is well received here. Let's not forget
this
that.
rally was incredibly well attended.
Compared to the rally that he held in 2016, my colleague Steve Harrison reported that there was more noise, more passion. This seemed like it was bigger than ever. And,
it was oversold. People were watching it outside on TV.
That's right. And so I think that this is a friendly audience for him here. And if you've ever been to one of his rallies here, you know that people come from miles around and fill these places.
And yet he used the opportunity to tell a lie. He was talking about the coronavirus, and he said he had a meeting that day with a lot of great companies, and, quote, they'll have vaccines relatively soon, and they're going to have something that makes you better, and that's going to take place even sooner, end quote. That flies in the face of everything every scientist and medical expert has been saying around the world.
Yeah, we're 12 to 18 months away, I think,
as
most
opposed
of the
to a
experts
few
say,
months,
as
right.
opposed to
Isn't
3
he
or 4
taking
months.
a terrible risk here? I mean, if he's out there saying this repeatedly, day after day, which he is, and this thing really does become a major, major problem, what does that? How do people react to that?
Well, I mean,
Even his
that's.
followers
I think the
react.
whole first segment of the show was in part about this idea of people not believing what they're told because there is so much misinformation, and Trump. What's the count now? I don't even know what the Washington Post count is. Is it 15,000, 20,000? I mean, look, this goes on to an unprecedented degree in this administration, and this is an example of why it's dangerous.
And his supporters aren't supporting him because they believe he's truthful about everything. I think many of them acknowledge that he stretches the truth. They want him because he's appointing Supreme Court justices that are conservative. He's cutting regulations. He's doing things that they favor. So they're willing to put up with that. That's baked into the cake.
And it's also a show, I think, for his support. And look, every politician in a way is a performer, but I think that is especially resonant with Trump supporters.
And there still are a lot of things that he hasn't done that he promised during the last election, and I think we need to point that out. But the fact that he's still talking about all those things, people like that.
Okay, so after the rally at Bojangles Coliseum, a lot of attendees evidently intended to grab something to eat at a nearby Bojangles restaurant and allegedly found the door locked. Then it was reported that at another Bojangles location, there was a sign taped to the door that read, "No one allowed in wearing Trump hats or shirts. You will be asked to leave." What's the story here?
It appears to be that a very young and probably inexperienced store manager or shift manager was overwhelmed. There were so many people in the store that he locked the door, apparently, and I wasn't there and I didn't report on that story. But from everything that I've read, this was not an effort to target Trump voters.
And in fact, I understand the other store with the sign on the door is alleging that was not put there by anybody who worked at the store.
Right, and it may have been intentional.
It was on the outside of the glass and was put there possibly by a customer.
Or a troll who's looking to stir up trouble.
Right.
And that was on social media where people saw that. And so, of course, they connected the dots and assumed that some Bojangles employee didn't want Trump supporters in the restaurant, and Bojangles flatly denied that and said that we don't deny service to anyone based on
The president
their...
gets a lot of mileage out of this "I'm being persecuted" line of thinking, and people love to hear that, and it works for him. And, this is just politics, I think.
Okay. Tell me they weren't serving that chicken sandwich, because that would make me mad, too, if I couldn't get in. All right, back to Super Tuesday for just a moment. It wasn't just the presidential candidates on the ballot, of course. There were other races, particularly here in North Carolina, that we know now that Democratic Governor Roy Cooper will be running against his Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest in November. They are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. So will this be a tight race, or will there be a clear dividing line here, do you think?
I expect it to be a tight race. You're in a presidential year. North Carolina, you turn purple in the face hearing how purple North Carolina is. So I would think it'd be a pretty close race. And they both, almost 90% in their primaries. These are two strong candidates, strong name recognition. They're going to get a lot of financial support. So, I think it's going to be a pretty close race.
Remember that Roy Cooper was in a close race with Pat McCrory last time around, and
went to overtime.
That's right. Lots of talk about about that. I think it'll be another close race. It may come down to which team gets the best turnout and who has the most registered voters.
And if one of them loses, maybe they can get a radio show. Two local folks were on the ballot this time running for higher office. City Councilwoman Dimple Ashmira ran to be state treasurer, and Mecklenburg County Commissioner Trevor Fuller ran in the Democratic primary for Senate. Both lost. Did either one of them have a real shot at either of those offices?
Dimple Ashmira put in a good showing in the treasurer's race. She did lose that by just a percentage point or two.
Yeah, she was very close.
Very strong race. And Trevor Fuller in his race for Senate, he had less than 4% of the vote.
I was
even close.
I was a little baffled by Trevor Fuller, obviously very well known. He has been chair of the county commissioners previously. But it was such a quiet campaign in terms of the Senate campaign. I mean, I know he was never high in the polls, but I just never really heard him say a whole lot.
He did not have a lot of money, and that made a big difference. Remember, this is one where people were spending, millions and millions of dollars.
And the winner on the Democratic side in that race was Cal Cunningham. He will be running against Tom Tillis, the incumbent Republican, in the fall. And it was alleged that national Democrats wanted Cunningham in this race, but Tillis has the money advantage at the moment. So will we see the National Democratic Party throw money at Cal Cunningham?
I think they're going to flood North Carolina
I
with money.
think they view this as winnable, and they will do that. I think at the moment, Tillis has raised over $10 million. Cal Cunningham is in the $5 million range, and he doesn't have as much left in the war chest because he had to spend it on this. So it's going to be an interesting race.
So even more local, the results of the primary in two county commission at-large races effectively decided who wins those seats because there was no Republican challenger. Ella Scarborough and Pat Cotham won on Tuesday, and newcomer Lee Altman was also voted in. How did that happen? Uncontested?
What? No, she had run the last time around. She ran for DeMont Clark's seat, right?
Okay, so was there an incumbent?
Trevor Fuller was not running again.
That's what happened.
No, well, she was at large, though, correct? Lee Altman? Yes, she was part of the at large. She, in fact, Ray McKinnon was right behind her with 13.8%. So, yeah, she was part of that big field.
And interestingly enough, Judge Aretha Blake easily won a second term on Mecklenburg County's district court. Now, normally we would probably not even have noticed this or mentioned it because judges are usually a mystery to most voters. But in this case, it's an exception because just prior to the election, WBTV reporter and frequent participant on this program, Nick Oxner, ran a story about her alleging that she was woefully behind on reaching a decision in some of her cases. Her backlog was alleged to have been as much as 2 to 3 years in some cases. This is a family court judge, so what was in the balance here is alimony and child support and things like that people need when marriages fall apart, and they were waiting 2 to 3 years for a decision. She took issue with that story. She sued Nick and the station, alleging that his reports were inaccurate and damaging to her campaign. Clearly, she was wrong about the second part of that. Where does all this stand?
I thought that this back and forth was extraordinarily interesting because had she not sued the station, I'm not sure voters would have known about this backlog or maybe even cared. I mean, Nick had done a fantastic job, and I applaud his investigative reporting, but it's not the most high-profile position that she was running for. And a few voters at the polls actually said, I didn't hear about the suing of the radio station. I don't know what you're talking about. So it really didn't cause as much of a stir as I guess we had assumed it would.
She got 69% of the vote. Right?
Yeah.
Yep. So, meanwhile, we all went back to paper ballots in Mecklenburg County this time around. Other parts of the country seem to have problems with machines jamming. Very quickly, did we have any problems with paper ballots here?
There were 2 counties that reported some issues with printers not being corrected properly, but other than that, it all went smoothly.
So, Michael Dickerson, big round of applause to him. He's the elections director here. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the Lindberg trial, verdict, the Scott Brooks homicide arrest, and more at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Actors Theater of Charlotte. Live, local, professional theater offering Charlotte residents an alternative night out with contemporary theater for adults. Info and tickets at atcharlotte.org. And Northeastern University partnering with employers to customize professional development programs designed to fit the needs of their organization. Northeastern.edu/Charlotte. Super Tuesday pairs the Democratic presidential field down to 2 major contenders, Coronavirus cases rear their heads in more states. A deadly tornado hits the Nashville area. Just some of the top national stories they'll be taking a look at as the Roundup continues in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock with a national point of view on 1A. Meanwhile, make plans to join us next Thursday morning at 7th Street Public Market, uptown, for a conversation with best-selling Charlotte author Kathy Reichs. You can get more details at WFAE.org/Charlotte Talks. And we're coming right back.
On the latest episode of Inside Politics, the RNC in Charlotte, a look at how one never-Trumper was thrown out of the Republican National Convention 4 years ago.
And how he's planning a protest or shadow convention during the real RNC in Charlotte.
And even if it's just one or two of us standing up, I mean, you got to do it.
Listen to Inside Politics, the RNC in Charlotte, on WFAE.org/Inside Politics and wherever you find podcasts.
It's the local news roundup on Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. David Borax is here. Not Brooks. David, he's a movie
New York
director.
Times?
Yeah, David Borax is here, reporter for WFAE News. Katie Peralta from the Charlotte Agenda. Glenn Berkins from QCityMetro.com. Eric Spanberg from the Charlotte Business Journal. Before we move on to other stories, surprising. It's actually surprising. A tiny little story, but it actually surprised me. The RNC, the Republican National Convention people, have decided they will not be booking the Bank of America Stadium for anything to do with their convention. It will all be in the venues they've already hired. And given the fact that there's this competition that has never stopped between President Trump and President Obama, I just naturally assumed he would want to make his acceptance speech in the stadium where Obama was going to make his acceptance speech had it not been for a threat of a thunderstorm. They're not going to do that. Why not?
Well,
I could fill it to the rafters.
Well, there is much speculation about that, I think, on all sides. Could he fill it to the rafters, or the Raptors? I guess the NBA champions would qualify. And if it doesn't, if it's not full, then the blowback from that. Also, one of the things I've wondered about, and we've never got an answer on, is our friend David Tepper is less than enamored with Donald Trump.
Is it available to them?
He said so many, many times. So I wonder if he would have made it available. The Panthers really haven't said much. So
there's always Memorial Stadium.
Under construction, sorry.
And that actually goes both ways. Given that he's not enamored, maybe the campaign said we don't want it.
Right.
I think it was the other way around. I think that the stadium was not open to be rented out in a major capacity. It's not about construction. There are still ballrooms and stuff opened for individual RNC events, but my understanding is that there were to be no political events, period, even if the RNC wanted.
Okay, the verdict in the trial of Greg Lindberg came in yesterday around lunchtime. He was found guilty of trying to bribe a North Carolina insurance regulator in hopes of reducing scrutiny of his business. So remind us what this trial was about and what was at stake here and the players involved.
So Mike Causey was being asked or I guess hinted at to reassign a regulator because Mr. Lindberg, I guess, was allegedly or now confirmed that he was worried about that regulator and how that regulator would oversee his company. And that's what started all this about the campaign donations.
And he was convicted of conspiracy to commit honest services wire fraud, these are the court's words, and bribery concerning programs receiving federal funds. His colleague John Gray also found guilty on 2 counts. Both of them could serve 20 to 30 years in prison for this. John Palermo, another associate, was acquitted of the 2 counts. Why? Do we know? Is anybody covering the trial? No, not close enough. All right. So this scheme involved the North Carolina Insurance Commissioner, Mike Causey, who almost instantly says he smelled a rat, and then began to cooperate with federal officials by wearing a wire. Here was his reaction yesterday to the outcome of this trial.
When I was sworn in, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I did pledge to root out insurance fraud and corruption. And so I look at it as doing my job.
WFAE's Gwendolyn Glenn talked to Mike Causey yesterday during All Things Considered. You can hear that full story and that full conversation at WFAE.org. This scheme also involved the former head of the Republican Party in North Carolina, Robin Hayes, who before the trial pled guilty to lying to investigators. What has happened to him?
He has not been sentenced yet. So, I mean, obviously, that's a very important point. Also, you probably said this at the top, Mike Causey is a Republican. So that adds a twist to this as well. And then Lindberg had supported Wayne Goodwin, who is now the head of the Democratic Party, but at the time was running against Mike Causey in 2016.
Wow. This is messy all around, isn't
yes.
it? Lindberg's attorney says this conviction will be appealed, but when will sentences be handed down? Next week? Week after next? When?
I don't know I don't have an answer to that, but it is going to be appealed. They're not done yet.
And the prosecutor wanted Mr. Lindberg to be jailed right down on the spot, which
Causey.
Yeah,
I mean, you're right, Lindberg.
Lindberg's attorney. Lindberg's attorney is described in the newspaper story as immediately agape. His mouth dropped at that, and I guess so did the judges, because the judges did not do that. All right, CMPD arrested 33-year-old Terry Connor Jr. for the murder of Scott Brooks last December. Scott was the co-owner of Noda's Brooks Sandwich House. Police are still looking for a second suspect. This has been described as something that might give closure to the Brooks family and to Scott Brooks' twin brother, David, but that is not exactly as David Brooks sees this.
I'm not sure if it starts a healing process or not, because, nothing's going to bring my brother back, but I mean, kudos to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. They were absolutely resilient in what they've done, and they will not give up. I will tell the community that.
One thing that we have learned about this is that Scott Brooks was killed over $100.
Mike, it feels like the past couple of years we have talked again and again about just sort of the low stakes that are involved in so many of these murders. Again, it's some argument, it's a small amount of money. Obviously, nothing would justify murder, but it is incredible how little is involved that ends up in tragedy.
Sorry, go ahead.
And even as we celebrate an arrest in this case, there's not a conviction, so everyone's innocent until proven guilty.
And he claims he's absolutely innocent.
Right, and we do know that some of the people charged with murder last year, those charges were dropped for insufficient evidence. But even as we celebrate an arrest in this case, we also have to remember that there are a lot of people who don't get that same attention, a lot of families out there who lose loved ones and they don't get the attention. Just in the last, during a 5-day period last week, we had homicide investigators investigated 6 deaths in the city.
Yeah.
2 people, we're unsure how they died. We don't know. They were found in a creek bed just near McAlpine Creek Park. But those numbers, those homicide numbers, while currently slightly below last year, they are inching back up.
It's important to remember that this is part of, we're still, I think, in the same trend that we were last year, where we had an elevated number of homicides. 16 so far this year. There were 20 at this point last year. If you include those 2 that you just mentioned, we would have 18. So we're tracking close to last year. It's still a major problem, and not all of the cases get the same attention, as you point out.
You reported in Q City Metro this list of murders that have taken place in the last week, and among the people shot who did not die was a 7-year-old boy who was wounded when somebody fired a bullet in the home where he was asleep.
He was sleeping in his home. He was wounded. He was shot in the shoulder. Thankfully, it was not a fatal wound. But for a lot of people, this is their life. Right. I live close to Center City, and just about every night there's gunfire in the neighborhood. We've got to do something better.
It's something that David Brooks acknowledged the other day too. He's fully aware that his family's getting more attention than 99% of the other cases. This is also an outlier. I mean, the Brooks family's white. They live in a neighborhood that's quickly changing. It's surrounded by $500,000 townhomes. This shook the community. People know that family, and I think that they are very much aware that this is a problem that goes way beyond NODA.
You're also reporting, Glenn, that CMPD is going to start expanding its hiring outreach. What does that mean?
Like all police departments in major cities, CMPD is losing more officers to retirements, things like that, than normal. More and more police officers are retiring or leaving the police force for whatever reason. And I think currently they need to hire about 175 police officers, and they hired a local marketing company to create some really slick ads that if you go online very much, you're probably going to see. They're going to be on gaming platforms, they're going to be in gyms, they're going to be different places, really slick ads promoting careers in law enforcement with CMPD.
Okay. Last week, it was announced that a mixed-use project on North Tryon between 6th and 8th, including the room in which we are currently sitting, had been in the planning stages for over 2 years. They were going to tear down the library. They were going to tear down big portions of Spirit Square. They were going to take the parking lot that's directly across the street from this window that we look out on here on 7th Street, and they were going to build a mixed-use project, offices, retail, and housing. The failure of this project at the moment seems to center on the intentions of Inlivian, the old Charlotte Housing Authority, and what they wanted to do with their piece of this property. What more do we know about this, David?
Well, there's a little bit of a he said, she said on this project, the county versus Inlivian, the housing authority. The original idea for this was that all the property owners in this 2 blocks, which include the county, the city, Inlivian, and Bank of America, that they would all get together and they would put their property up to a developer and have this mixed-use project that would include housing and shops and offices and affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And Inlivian says that they never agreed to sell their property, that they just wanted to lease it, and they had their own idea about what the project that they were doing should look like, and they were basically dropped out of the project.
How do you get 2 years into the planning stages and then find out that one of the people is not going to sell their property, you just want to lease it?
That's part of the he said, she said, is that there's a lot of, we always said all along that we weren't going to sell, and on the other side there is, it looked like you were going to sell.
Last week when we talked about this briefly, it was reported that the component of this, the Inlivian component, is affordable housing, which other developers now say is not economically feasible.
And the county says is not economically feasible, which is
a little
really
surprising, and it's disappointing to some people who felt like, here we have publicly owned property that could be put to use for affordable housing uptown so that people who have service jobs could live near their jobs.
Who owns the lot? Who owns that lot?
This lot right here is owned by Bank of America.
Okay.
That's the one right next to us where we're speaking right now. The lot next to that, which is the tall brick building, is the old hotel there. That was slated to become a boutique hotel. The rest of the property here is owned by Mecklenburg County and the library.
We should turn the Facebook camera toward the property we're talking about.
I was also going to say, Mike, however you feel about whatever side you come down on, the county manager, Dina DiOrio, said that affordable housing you could get 3 times as much by building it farther out. Well, of course. I don't think, that's not breaking news. So I think there's going to be some pushback on that, particularly when you look at this as a community where they've raised $200 million private and public in the last couple of years to focus on affordable housing.
They're trying to push some of this out for a little further because in Ballantyne Reimagined, it's a plan by Northwood Investors, is meeting resistance from City Council over, are you ready?
Yes.
Affordable housing. What is the project's vision, Katie, I guess?
So Ballantyne Reimagined is basically a gigantic upfit of Ballantyne Corporate Park. They want to, add like a little town center with a main drag and apartments and hotels and offices. And they are seeking several tens of millions of dollars in public funds for infrastructure improvements. And the city is saying, well, we're not sure if you have enough affordable housing. They want to see more targeted at like the 30% ish AMI. So folks who make around $24,000. Ballantyne does not have, I don't think, any of that. So it's going to be a pretty big sticking point, I would imagine, for City Council if they do agree to commit those funds for this project.
Councilmember Malcolm Graham said, I appreciate the affordable housing units. It's just not enough. Dimple Ajmera, councilwoman at large, says she wants to see the number of affordable units increase because of the public investment in the development. Both are Democrats. Republican Councilman Ed Driggs says he too would like to see more affordable housing, but, quote, the council needs to be realistic about the economics. How much public money is going into this project?
$42.5 million is what they're asking for, and it would generate somewhere around $1.5 billion in tax revenue. I suspect that there will be a long and loud debate about this, but I think ultimately the council will fund this.
Okay. Meanwhile, for years we've been following the sad saga of Wells Fargo, which has been immersed in scandals that led to the resignation of the former CEO, John Stumpf, who's been banned from banking for life. Now we discover his successor, Tim Sloan, also no longer with the bank, gave misleading, inaccurate testimony to Congress, and that Maxine Waters may turn his name over to the Justice Department for prosecution because he lied to Congress in a hearing a year ago, she says. He resigned later that month, and apparently that's just the tip of the iceberg of this new revelation. And next week, Charlie Scharf, the new CEO, and Chair Betsy Duke, who used to be with Wachovia, are going before the Banking Committee, and Maxine Waters may call for her resignation.
Guess what? If you're into business news, watching those hearings will be quite entertaining or interesting because that's going to be a bloodbath. And as you said, Mike, Wells Fargo has spent the past several years just going up to Capitol Hill and getting demolished, and they're about to have that happen again.
Stay tuned. Well, we're gonna end on a happy note and a strange note, because longtime host of All Things Considered and now special NPR correspondent Susan Stamberg received a really high and unusual honor for a radio news person this week. She now has a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame. She's on that sidewalk with Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny, Dorothy Lamour, Jerry Lewis, Johnny Carson, to name just a couple of people. The unveiling was on Super Tuesday, which Stamberg called the superest Tuesday she ever had. Actress Annette Bening made the presentation to her. Of course, NPR listeners know her as the first woman ever to anchor a nightly news program beginning in 1971. You knew that, right?
Absolutely. You told me today.
She's been at NPR ever since, and according to her, the star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame has the wrong name on it. She says it should be that of NPR. First of all, she says it's shorter. It's only 3 letters. Okay. Well, thank
Easy
you.
to spell?
That's right. She's a great person. We had her on the show maybe 2 years ago. She's terrific.
She's got a much better voice than Mel Blanc.
Yes, yes,
that's all, folks.
That is all, folks. David Borak from WFAE, Katie Peralta, from the Charlotte Agenda, Glenn Berkins from QCityMetro.com, and Eric Spanberg from the Charlotte Business Journal. Thank you all for the hour.